Hey everyone, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is Wednesday, December the 18th, and the topic for today's video is going to be the Sun in Sagittarius in a perfect square to Neptune in Pisces. And before we get into that, I'd just like to recap a few things that happened since making my last video. I have taken a certain approach to doing these astrology videos where I'm not getting into doing the full moon, but I should point out that the full moon was actually quite a dramatic one due to it being, for one thing, conjunct Jupiter in Gemini in an opposition to Mercury in Sagittarius, which was stationing direct. And my last video I made, I have to admit my last video that I recorded only got 2 likes, which is, I usually average about 5 likes on my videos, and I made it basically about Canadian politics, because that was what was on my mind at the time. And since, with that station of direct motion, we just had a big kerfuffle where the finance minister quit, and the Trudeau government is looking in big trouble, and all this kind of stuff. But I think that was maybe I was anticipating some sort of a political mess with what was happening in Canada anyways, right? So I'm going to spare you that topic this video, and I have something completely different in mind, although it may have a certain political side to it. But I have to also point out that so far in these videos that I've been recording, I have yet to address the whole situation about the drone invasion in the USA, and I have to admit that I have been watching these videos, but I've been hesitant to say anything one way or the other about it, because there is a certain quality of what's going on that's ambiguous, right? There's a certain quality where you're not sure if what you're being shown or what we had the government announcing that having these UFO hearings where they're basically saying the American government is having people tell us that aliens are real and they have recovered crashed UFOs and things like this. But there's also this stuff is always really mixed in with what you call psyops, and there's a certain ambiguity about whether or not this is true or false, or if this is just used as a kind of a smokescreen, a distraction from other things, and all that. And there's this kind of greater underlying issue at play, which is this kind of do we take the world of appearances around us, or the world as it presents itself, at face value to be real, or is it possible it's an illusion, that we live in a dream world and that we are basically sleepwalking through this dream world that we take to be reality? And there's a certain teacher that, I mean, this may at this point in time, this whole idea may seem to be kind of old hat, but there is a certain teacher that focused on this idea of trying to wake people up from this sort of like daydream slumber, and that person, I'm assuming you can see in the shot that I've rearranged my posters in the background, and I've got up a poster of a man named Gurdjieff, who was a teacher at the time of the 19th century, and I think this is appropriate for Neptune, because the discovery of Neptune happened after the discovery of Uranus. Uranus was discovered around the time of the French Revolution, the American Revolution. Following that, there was a kind of a renewed interest in spiritualism. There were certain people like the famous founders of the New Age, such as Helena Blavatsky, specifically identified Gurdjieff as her pick for who is going to be the teacher that would be the kind of the dawn of the New Age. However, there's a certain kind of controversy around this, because Blavatsky ended up being influential to not just people like Mahatma Gandhi, but also Adolf Hitler, right? So there's a certain kind of inherent controversy about the 19th century New Age stuff, but I have to admit that at some point in time, I made friends with some people who were involved in Gurdjieff fourth way groups, and I spent a certain amount of time in what was not to be considered technically a fourth way work group, but rather a study group, in which to be introduced and to learn the teachings of Gurdjieff and the people who have come after him. And there's something about this which I have to admit, one of the things that Gurdjieff talks about is this whole movement towards wholeness, right? In that, and I have to admit that there's something about this that I feel still partial about, in that I find, as much as I find the teachings of Gurdjieff valuable, I still feel like there's some part of me that resists it. There's some part of me that doesn't quite jive with it. But in spite of that, I still continue to study Gurdjieff's teachings, and I still find something valuable about them. But I'm just, for the sake of just, I'm not going to pretend to be more devoted to this particular thing than I am, but there's a certain reason why I haven't been publicly trying to make videos telling people about Gurdjieff teachings or trying to make posts about Gurdjieff stuff, and that there's something about the what we can talk about in terms of New Age spirituality and what tends to proliferate online as this kind of just like this default New Age kind of style, which often goes with these kinds of things like, aligning your chakras and stuff like that. It's it's kind of like a mishmash between like yoga and crystal, and there's sometimes Gurdjieff stuff gets in there, right? Or sometimes people who are into that stuff might bring up a Gurdjieff kind of idea without really knowing where it came from, but there's something about the Gurdjieff teaching or the Gurdjieff style which is its own thing. It's like it's specific, and if you just conflate it with all this other New Age stuff, there's something that you're missing out on. And there's some kind of like, I think there's also this tendency just to dismiss all New Age stuff out of hand. Like it's just all just a bunch of bullshit. Like the way the way Deepak Chopra is often treated. You know what I mean? Like really kind of condescendingly dismissed and stuff like that. But for this reason, I think Gurdjieff has the advantage, and there's a lot of stuff in the Gurdjieff teaching that's just not the same as what you're going to get from the New Age movement at large, right? And there's basically, why am I bringing up Gurdjieff now is because the fourth way Gurdjieff style teacher that I know has invited me back into doing studying the Gurdjieff material, and I have to admit that I'm still, like I said, I'm still kind of not, I don't know if I'm fully on board with it or not, but I find there's something valuable enough about it to justify continuing with it. Or I have to admit there's other inherent thing about this, which has to do with, I have my own experience with what I think of as spiritual emergency, which also relates to like basically psychosis, going crazy and stuff like that. There's something about I basically found out about Gurdjieff through other people in the spiritual emergence community who had shared interests in astrology and all this kind of stuff. And there's something about going in that direction that makes more sense to me than a lot of what everybody else is doing, right? But that's not to say that there's may be certain pros and cons. I don't know. I'm just putting it out there anyways. The guy who I know who is a fourth way style teacher has invited, or basically there's something going on where he is trying to get the study groups going, but the previous members of the group have all been too busy either being parents or working full-time jobs, all that kind of stuff, to have enough, like, it's been really difficult to get the members of the group actively participating, right? And the other thing is, in contrast to this, I have to admit that in 2017, that's when I first started learning astrology and started doing charts for people as a way to, I just kind of like learn by doing. I'll do your chart to figure out how astrology works, that kind of stuff. That's by doing that, that's what led me to meet people who are into Gurdjieff and stuff like this. At the same time, I was in a Philip K. Dick book club for Valis, not an online one, but an in-person book club. And one of the members in the Philip K. Dick book club, I don't know if it was like, it kind of felt like it was him reacting to my interest in astrology and New Age stuff. But this guy was kind of like, maybe you should get into like Deleuze and Guattari instead, right? And up until that point, I was really not familiar with Deleuze and Guattari. There's some kind of thing about, he was trying to get a Deleuze and Guattari book club going, but it didn't really work out very well. And I don't know if I made an ass out of myself just being confused and bewildered by the Deleuze and Guattari stuff. But it was kind of funny because that was kind of around the same time that I found out about Deleuze and Guattari. I also found out about Gurdjieff. And there's also, in a weird parallel right now, the 3 podcasts, one of which I support on Patreon, are putting on a Deleuze and Guattari Anti-Oedipus book club at the same time. And while we're really struggling to find people to join us in our studying Gurdjieff material, the Deleuze and Guattari book club is like popping, right? They got over 100 people in every single one of their Zoom meetings, and there's like there's tons of activity. They're going to have all these breakout groups and stuff like that. And there's just sort of like, it's a weird polarity because it's like, if you want to get into Deleuze and Guattari right now, the wind is at your back. But if you want to do Gurdjieff stuff, it's like we can't find enough people who are interested. So I've basically been asked to, but there's something about this is that I don't know if there's a certain kind of, from a certain perspective, these things may look like they are set up in antithesis to each other, and this is mainly because there's a certain approach that Deleuze tends to take that Gurdjieff would probably categorize Deleuze and Guattari as being what he would call the Hasnamus individuals, right? These are people who are not, they're out of alignment in a dangerous kind of way, right? They're kind of bad influences, right? However, I'm going to spill the beans right now and sort of admit that there's a kind of underlying influence in that if you look at the references to the reference notes to Antioedipus, what you get in the introduction is first reference, Henry Miller, Sexus. Second reference, Friedrich Nietzsche, on the genealogy of morals. Then Henry Miller, Ivan Illich, then R.D. Lang. It's Henry Miller. I'll link it in the description. Henry Miller talks about Gurdjieff. There's recordings of him talking about Gurdjieff explicitly. And then if you start to familiarize yourself with the Gurdjieff material, you'll start to see the Gurdjieff influence on Henry Miller. I read Henry Miller, back when I was in my early 20s, before I had any psychiatric problems. And I had no idea who Gurdjieff was at that time. But I was a Henry Miller reader. I actually have. I've had this book in my collection for a while. This is the first reference in Antioedipus, Henry Miller's Sexus. I haven't read anyways, Henry Miller knew about Gurdjieff and all this kind of stuff. There's also, R.D. Lang was also into like this Eastern spirituality kind of trip or whatever. There's also another figure of that kind of 1960s counterculture era. Carlos Castaneda was a guy who was this is kind of what I'm talking about. Neptune is a certain sense of ambiguity. Right? That Castaneda had this whole story about the teaching of Don Juan that a lot of people, were inspired by, that maybe influenced people's spiritual practice, but there was a question of whether this Don Juan character was even real, of whether any of the stuff in the Carlos Castaneda teachings even happened, whether this was a fiction, it's just a construction, just an illusion. You see what I'm saying? And Neptune has to do with this kind of fantasy, right? This kind of thing that you believe that there's this teaching of Don Juan, and you're getting it straight. But apparently, word on the street anyways is that Carlos Castaneda actually was in a fourth way group learning Gurdjieff stuff, and he just basically repackaged Gurdjieff teaching and sold it as his own thing, right, to avoid the complications of having to be stuck in that lineage, right? And in Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus, there's a whole plateau chapter specifically talking about Carlos Castaneda, right? So there's something about Gurdjieff is an unconscious influence on Deleuze and Guattari, whether they never mention Gurdjieff outright. So there's this kind of unconscious influence on Deleuze and Guattari, and I find by studying Gurdjieff, then that actually helps me understand Deleuze and Guattari, right? However, there's a certain basic kind of tension that I find in that it basically has to do with Felix Guattari being a communist, right? Being a Marxist, and Deleuze being or the whole project of Deleuze and Guattari being Freudian Marxian. Although the thing is that what they're doing is they're doing a critique of Freud, and they're in such a way that these are guys who come from Felix Guattari being a Lacanian, and basically rebelling against that whole tradition in such a way where they're actually like rebelling against this Freudian perspective that actually puts them in a weird way more in alignment with Gurdjieff than you would expect, right? But there's still this basic tension in that Deleuze and Guattari are categorized as disciples of Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, and that is seen as a certain antithesis to Gurdjieff, right? But the thing is, if you start getting into the Gurdjieff stuff, you'll start noticing that Gurdjieff talks a lot about the eternal return, right? And in the Gurdjieff group, they try to talk about the eternal return as a Gurdjieff idea, but then as I start to learn more about philosophy, I'm like, wait a minute, Nietzsche was really into the eternal return, right? And then as I start to read more Nietzsche, I start to realize, this is probably what happened, was that Gurdjieff was around in the 19th century, and there was at a certain moment where there was a crisis of faith, right? And the person who was talking about this crisis of faith was Friedrich Nietzsche. God is dead and all of this, right? And Nietzsche was making all these attacks and criticisms of religion, and I think to some extent, I can't really speculate how much Gurdjieff was reading Nietzsche, but there was, in the environment, you had to deal with this as just like the time you were alive, the cultural moment and there's something about where there's a lot of, in some way, Gurdjieff, I think, is using Nietzschean ideas, but trying to take them away from the direction that they go in, which he considers to be the Hasnamus direction, right? But I find it like there's something about, I'm not entirely on board. Well, I don't know. There's something about this which has motivated me to read Nietzsche more so than I would have been without the Gurdjieff influence, right? And part of the issue here is that there's also this whole thing, too, about, like, I want to avoid trying to brand or label myself as being, like, I had an opportunity, anyways, to try to do some silly thing and call it Deleuzian astrology, to label yourself a Deleuzian, to label yourself a Nietzschean, to basically put some other person's name up as like a flag post, and you're like, I'm just doing this guy's thing. That's not how I relate to the world, and quite frankly, I don't even know. I mean, I enjoy reading Deleuze and Guattari, but I don't know if I'm reading Deleuze and Guattari in the way that I need, like, I'm going to subscribe to everything they put out there, right? And actually, there's a new trend right now of Christian Nietzscheans, which may seem like a contradiction, but there's this whole thing, people make this argument that Friedrich Nietzsche is basically, by taking the problem of the disenchantment or the secular rationalism, like taking the problem that we've all lost faith in this kind of metaphysical religious order, and we're going to be just a bunch of secular rationalists. Like, by taking that problem seriously, he's taking seriously what does a world robbed of its religious belief, what are the problems of that? And there's a lot of people who read Nietzsche not to be atheists, but to be like, yeah, Nietzsche's pointing out why it's a good thing to have religion, right? Rather than like taking Nietzsche and turning him on his head, right? And there's also a lot of people who take Deleuze is maybe starts out as a guy who's really rebellious and really anti-religious, but then by the time that Deleuze is in his late period, Deleuze is let's say he's come full circle, right? But in a way that I'm not going to get into all this right now. It makes it kind of complicated. But anyways, I'm trying to explain my own position as being somebody who's interested in a bunch of different things. If you are interested in learning about Gurdjieff or that sort of want to get involved in that thing, I guess leave a comment or send me a message or an email or something like that. Get a hold of me. Maybe I should, I don't know. I don't have a website. I'm on Facebook. I'm trying to avoid Facebook. I should probably sort out my contact things. Anyway, with that in mind, I'm going to read a little bit about the stuff. Before I do that, I'm just going to show you, because I have this bookshelf in the background, but a lot of the books are kind of like below here, so I'm going to show you some of my collection of. First of all, I started out before I even got involved with the Gurdjieffians. I read this book first, Meetings with Remarkable Men, and this has a movie made after it. If you want to watch the movie, and then this is part 2 in a series called All and Everything. More recently, I bought. This is maybe a bit of a gimmick, but I bought an original version of Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. And then if you open it up, you can see it's got a picture of the man Gurdjieff here himself. I don't know, it's maybe a bit silly to, well, it is what it is. The guy that is trying to get me, or trying to recruit more people to do this Gurdjieff stuff, originally he's asking me to start up a Beelzebub Tales for His Grandson reading group, or that's what he told me we were going to do. But instead of doing that, like, I went in there expecting that, but instead we're doing this other teacher named E.J. Gold, who has a book called The Human Biological Machine as a Transformational Apparatus, which I don't actually have a hard copy of, but I do have. E.J. Gold's The American Book of the Dead, which is a kind of an effort to kind of do a kind of a Tibetan Book of the Dead thing, but not get kind of bogged down in the trappings of running off to, the exoticism of another culture, but to ground that in a kind of like a kind of a Western perspective, right? I also have this book, which is called The Hidden Work, which kind of, there's a certain thing where part of this is supposed to be something where you're doing a practice that's in private, and it's not to like show off to everybody. So that's one of my motivations for not being that. But I'm doing that. I'm being asked to sort of see if anybody's interested in learning about this stuff. So I might as well show what I got here. I also have, which was recommended by the people when I started doing this stuff with them a few years ago, P.D. Ouspensky, who's kind of like a partner, a writing partner. The thing is, Gurdjieff didn't know how to speak English. So everything that you get from Gurdjieff is written, I think, in Russian and then translated into English, or else basically through P.D. Ouspensky. This is Ouspensky giving a lecture that's very much influenced by Gurdjieff, introducing the basically this kind of evolutionary, this kind of spiritual evolution, right? There is this whole thing called evolutionary astrology, but to keep it simple, these guys, you have to respect that these guys are doing their own thing, basically, right? Do I have any more? Oh, there's also a famous, this is a recent one that came out during the time of the pandemic, was Mystical Courage by Cynthia, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Bourgeot. And this is basically a book full of Gurdjieff exercises, right? This book is just kind of it's a thin book. It's basically just gives you some practices to do. I also, what's interesting is that with the Deleuze and Guattari thing, there's a big influence of Wilhelm Reich, and I also got this other book called Reich and Gurdjieff, where this guy is kind of trying to these two things which may seem kind of weirdly in contrast to each other could actually be brought together in a kind of a synthesis or whatever. I don't, but that's another Gurdjieff book I have. I think that's it. But except for, I'm going to read you. There's also P.D. Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, and this is Ouspensky basically talking about his experience with Gurdjieff, and I'm going to read you some of this right now. Now, part of the thing, again, I have to admit that I don't know if I'm wholly on board with this, because there's something about the attitude towards a one right way versus all the ways we make mistakes and error and sin and stuff like this, right? There's something of there's a certain kind of, this feels conservative to me, right? But there's something about that, in spite of all this, of why I still get won over by Gurdjieff. And you have to give, despite all the things you may not like about him, there's something that keeps you going, right? So I'm going to read here to give you an example of why I think Gurdjieff is still valuable, or why I'm not just dismissing this whole stuff out of hand, right? Okay. How can a wrong way be recognized? Asked somebody. How can it be recognized? Said G. It is impossible to recognize a wrong way without knowing the right way. This means that it is no use troubling oneself how to recognize a wrong way. One must think of how to find the right way. This is what we are speaking about all the time. It cannot be said in 2 words, but from what I have said, you can draw many useful conclusions if you remember everything that has been said and everything which follows from it. For example, you can see that the teacher always corresponds to the level of the pupil. The higher the pupil, the higher can be the teacher. But a pupil of a level which is not particularly high cannot count on a teacher of a very high level. Actually, a pupil can never see the level of the teacher. This is a law. No one can see higher than his own level, but usually people who not only do not know this, but on the contrary, the lower they are themselves, the higher the teacher they demand. The right understanding of this point is already a very considerable understanding, but it occurs very seldom. Usually the man himself is not worth a brass farthing, but he must have as a teacher no other than Jesus Christ. To less he will not agree. And it never enters his head that even if he were to meet such a teacher as Jesus Christ, taking him as he is described in the Gospels, he would never be able to follow him, because it would be necessary to be on the level of an apostle in order to be a pupil of Jesus Christ. Here is a definite law. The higher the teaching, the more difficult for the pupil. And if the difference in levels of the teacher and pupil go beyond a certain limit, then the difficulties in this path of the pupil become insuperable. It is exactly in connection with this law that there occurs one of the fundamental rules of the fourth way. On the fourth way, there is not one teacher. Whoever is the elder, he is the teacher. And as the teacher is indispensable to the pupil, so also is the pupil indispensable to the teacher. The pupil cannot go on without the teacher, and the teacher cannot go on without the pupil or pupils. And this is not a general consideration, but an indispensable and quite concrete rule on which is based the law of a man's ascending. As has been said before, no one can ascend onto a higher step until he places another man in his own place. What a man has received, he must immediately give back. Only then can he receive more. Otherwise, from him, he will be taken even what he has already been given. So this particularly, I have to admit, I don't want to pick on specific people, but that is essentially what I'm going to do, is that a friend of mine who is in the Philip K. Dick Valis book club with is a good example of this, because there's a certain idea of what, you're trying to look for spirituality that's going to help you in some way. And there's a certain guy, he has this attitude, like at the time, let's say I had a meditation teacher that I worked with, and this meditation teacher more recently has just gotten involved in a kind of Eckhart Tolle group, right? And what I notice is there's a certain kind of snobby, kind of hypercritical attitude that is really quick to dismiss people like Eckhart Tolle, like Deepak Chopra, like, what's another good example? I don't know, Marianne Williamson, she did the intro to this book, right? But there's something about it where it's like, you got a person who, and I don't want to be too judgmental, because Lord knows we're all imperfect, and it would just be mean to pick on this person's for his flaws and his problems. But this is a person who's a very, if you have a very flawed and imperfect person, but you say, hey man, I'm getting with these Eckhart Tolle people, and they just be like, Eckhart Tolle, that guy is a charlatan, he's a fake. It's bullshit, I'm a serious, devoted Christian, you know what I mean? Like, these people, like, anybody who's, like, of these kind of, like, popular New Age teachers they're just scammers, they're out just to get your money, and I need to have, I need the institution of the Catholic Church, of, like, the wasn't something that's really respectable, right? Because, and, like, I need basically the highest teacher, I need somebody who's the real deal, not some phony who's just, I need a real savior to save my, but it's like it's like if somebody was a little bit more mature, they could maybe see that somebody like Eckhart Tolle could actually be helpful for them without being like, who are you you're not Jesus Christ, you're not the Buddha, no way, and then being like, well, what are you doing with your life that makes you so judgmental, right? It's like, it's absurd, right? So there's this kind of thing where it's like, it actually makes a lot of sense to be like, it's not saying that the teacher is like, oh, I found this guy who's like the Buddha. It's like, no, this guy is probably not perfect himself, but he's more approachable than trying to have this, like, we're going to make the goal some, like, the possible peak of Mount Everest. So basically, so that you'll never even take the trip in the first place, and you get to be like, oh, woe is me, the world just doesn't understand, I can't do anything, rather than, and it's also funny because in spite of all the fact that, like, people like Eckhart Tolle are often picked on and criticized and stuff like that, do you guys, I don't know if you heard this, but apparently, all we've recently had the most epic rap battle of all time between Drake and Kendrick Lamar. I found out recently, I mean, I'm going to have to, like, check my sources, but what I heard was that apparently Kendrick Lamar is actually friends with Eckhart Tolle, and it can, like, it's like the last thing you'd expect. Like, there's all these people who are like, I sometimes watch people, like, I'm kind of like a nerdy white guy, and I don't claim to really be up on, like, like the whatever's cool with hip hop or something like that, right? I'm kind of like a white nerd, right? But there's this, other people are like, yeah, I'm not up on the Kendrick Lamar thing because I'm not much of a urban hip hopper guy, and but then you ask these people, like, oh, well, do you like Eckhart Tolle? And they're like, oh, that guy is just, he's like goes on Oprah. I would never listen. I need like an esteemed guru. I don't need this, some pop psychology, new age woo woo shit. But then Kendrick Lamar is like, Kendrick Lamar is like slaying in the most epic rap battle of all history, and he's somehow getting like support from Eckhart Tolle, and like, it's just the funniest thing, right? Because it's like, if you can step out of your judgmental, critical mind enough, and that you can make some I don't know. There's something about this which it actually makes a lot of sense to me. Anyways, right? Anyway, so another one from In Search of the Miraculous. I'm going again with the Sun square Neptune about the whole thing that we are all asleep, right? Or there's some sort of dream or illusion that we're stuck with, and there's a teaching about waking, but also this fact that but there's something about, again, this particular friend of mine that I was trying to, a guy who had similar issues with psychosis and the how that crosses into spiritual mania and all this kind of stuff. And I was always trying to like approach it from maybe like Kundalini or something like that. But then he would always write like, how do you know it's Kundalini? You know, how can you, you know, how do we know what Kundalini is? We need some sort of expert. And then you get this thing where there's these people who are like, I bought a book on Kundalini when I was going through all this stuff. And then because the internet, everybody's just on the internet, like, you get involved in these groups, and the people that are in the book are on there talking to you, and the people in the book are like, you're either mentally ill or you have Kundalini. You can't have both at the same time. We need to make a clear distinction between mental illness and Kundalini, and people just buy into this thing where you're like, you can't talk about Kundalini because you need a trained Kundalini professional to diagnose you and to to validate you and all this kind of stuff. And then if you're just on there in the comment section with the person who's writing the books, you're like, oh my God, they're gonna think this person is just gonna think that I am just like a mentally ill person who doesn't have Kundalini. I don't know. There's that background, and it's going into this. So I'm gonna, with that in mind, I'm gonna read a little bit more about this, right? Okay. There is an Eastern tale which speaks about a very rich magician who had a great many sheep, but at the same time this magician was very mean. He did not want to hire shepherds, nor did he want to erect a fence about the pasture where his sheep were grazing. The sheep consequently wandered into the forest, fell into ravines, and so on, and above all they ran away, for they knew that the magician wanted their flesh and skins, and this they did not like. At last, the magician found a remedy. He hypnotized his sheep and suggested to them, first of all, that they were immortal and that no harm was being done to them when they were skinned. That, on the contrary, it would be very good for them and even pleasant. Secondly, he suggested that the magician was also a good master who loved his flock so much that he was ready to do anything in the world for them. And in the third place, he suggested to them that if anything at all were going to happen to them, it was not going to happen just then, at any rate not that day, and therefore he had no need to think about it. Further, the magician suggested to his sheep that they were not sheep at all. To some of them he suggested that they were lions, to others that they were eagles, to others that they were men, and to others that they were magicians. And after this, all his cares and worries about the sheep came to an end. They never ran away again, but quietly awaited the time when the magician would require their flesh and skins. This tale is a very good illustration of man's position. In so-called occult literature, you have probably met with the expression Kundalini, the fire of Kundalini, the serpent of Kundalini. This expression is often used to designate some kind of strange force which is present in man and which can be awakened. But none of the known theories gives the right explanation of the force of Kundalini. Sometimes it is connected with sex energy, that is, with the idea of the possibility of using sex energy for other purposes. This latter is entirely wrong because Kundalini can be in anything. Now, notice there's a kind of interesting parallel to Deleuze and Guattari, for any Deleuze or Guattarians out there listening to this, about how they're talking about how Freud wanted to make this primary sex libido drive thing, and then Jung was saying it's just an energy that doesn't necessarily have to be about sex. It could be about a productive energy that could be about anything, right? And above all, Kundalini is not anything desirable or useful for man's development. It is very curious how these occultists have got a hold of the word from somewhere, but have completely altered its meaning, and from a very dangerous and terrible thing, they have made something to be hoped for and to be awaited as some blessing. And I'm not gonna hold back here. I have to admit, the people that I have met who are really into Kundalini yoga do not seem to be the brightest bulbs in the bunch. I'm just going to say this could just be a coincidence, right? Maybe there are some really highly intelligent, sophisticated Kundalini, but the people that I have met kind of seem like morons that like Kundalini yoga. You know, and I'm sorry if I've offended you. I'm sorry. This is just what my experience is like. It does. The people that I'm into, who are into Kundalini yoga that I've met, do not stir up in me a kind of like, oh, great, I want to be like them, right? Or it seems like, why, like, there's a certain risk factor to Kundalini, and you're stimulating this for what do you think you're going to get out of this that's going to help? So again, this is why Gurdjieff, I feel like, and it's completely, there's something about the what tends to proliferate in online New Age communities, which I feel this. I'm personally choosing. I'd rather go with this stuff than what a lot of these, your generic kind of brand of New Age chakra balancing stuff that you hear about, right? I'm more inspired by this, anyways, right? In reality, Kundalini is the power of imagination, the power of fantasy, which takes the place of a real function. When a man dreams instead of acting, when his dreams take on the place of reality, when a man imagines himself to be an eagle, a lion, or a magician, it is the force of Kundalini acting in him. Kundalini can act in all centers, and with its help, all the centers can be satisfied with the imaginary instead of the real. A sheep which considers itself a lion or a magician lives under the power of Kundalini. Kundalini is a force put into men in order to keep them in their present state. If men could really see their true position and could understand all the horror of it, they would be unable to remain where they are even for 1 second. They would begin to seek a way out, and they would quickly find it because there is a way out. But men fail to see it simply because they are hypnotized. Kundalini is the force that keeps them in a hypnotic state. To awaken for man means to be dehypnotized. In this lies the chief difficulty, and in this also lies the guarantee of its possibility, for there is no organic reason for sleep, and man can awaken. Theoretically can, but practically it is almost impossible, because as soon as a man awakens for a moment and opens his eyes, all the forces that caused him to fall asleep begin to act upon him with tenfold energy, and he immediately falls asleep again, very often dreaming that he is awake or is awakening. But there are certain states in ordinary sleep in which man wants to awaken, but he cannot. He tells himself that he is awake, but in reality he continues to sleep, and this can happen several times before he finally awakes. But in ordinary sleep, once he is awake, he is in a different state, in a hypnotic sleep. The case is otherwise. There are no objective characteristics, at any rate not in the beginning of awakening. A man cannot pinch himself in order to make sure that he is not asleep, and if, which God forbid, a man has heard anything about objective characteristics, Kundalini at once transforms it all into imagination and dreams. Only a man who fully realizes the difficulty of awakening can understand the necessity of long and hard work in order to awake. So, I could keep going, but, you get the gist, right? The basic idea is that the Gurdjieff groups are a bunch of people who are trying to work as a team to help to keep each other awake, right? And that's kind of the idea. Now, with that in mind, there's some kind of parallel. There's something about my own experience with madness that I think very much relates to this, as well as certain risks inherent to the situation right now, especially with the pretense that I've suggested. I haven't really gone into it that much in this video, but the whole drone invasion. Do you guys know? You probably are familiar with War of the Worlds. This H.G. Wells story that was turned into a radio play, and that people thought there was an alien invasion going on. There was a mass hysteria, right? But it was all just a fantasy. It was all just a make-believe, right? And now we have a media event which is somewhere in between, where people can't really decide what is real, what isn't real. And this is, you don't have to probably have me to tell you this, that this could be something deliberately put on by the government to sow confusion or disorder. At the same time, as a Canadian, the Donald Trump government has been trolling the Canadian, calling Canada the 51st state, calling Trudeau the governor of Canada, basically making a joke threatening annexation, right? But the thing is, there's a difference between making a literal threat of annexation and making a joke where it's kind of like there's an ambiguity. Do you want to annex us or not? Because we don't have a military. If you wanted to, you could just come in, take our whole country. But you're not saying that you're not saying you're literally going to annex us. You're making a joke, teasing us that maybe you'll annex us, right? At the same time, are you telling us there's literally aliens, or are you making a joke, teasing us? Oh, we're putting you in a state where you're hyper vigilant, never sure what is real, what is not, right? And the whole idea of psychosis is a person becomes ungrounded from reality, and what they are experiencing is their own fantasy, their own imagination. They are imagining all this stuff, right? And they are, rather than, and this what Gurdjieff is saying is that Kundalini is typically an excess of unspent potential energy, rather than going out and doing what you need to do in the world, taking care of your business. You have been lost in a kind of a dream world, of a kind of a daydream sleep, right? And that, but you know what? My own experience with this, I have to admit, there's something that I am starting to figure out to do with, this is funny because I have this problem with I live with my mother and my sister, and they both tend to be less, I don't even know. I want to say they're less spiritually inclined, but I noticed my mom and my sister start talking about things like manifestation. Right? One day my mom will be saying, oh, I love Richard Dawkins. I like science. I believe in science, not all the superstition stuff. And then the next day my mom is totally superstitious. She doesn't want to say the wrong thing to jinx it. And she talks about manifesting stuff. Right? So which one is it? Is it what? I don't really think what I realized is not to get into conversations like this with my mother, because it tends to just frustrate her. Right? Or she doesn't want to talk about this stuff. Right? So but there's this kind of inherent issue with the idea of manifestation, or being delusional, being in some sort of fantasy, right? Preceding my first hospitalization, the first time I was psychotic, one of the things that brought it on there were certain phenomena that would be maybe considered to be like hallucinations or something like that, but there was also the experience of synchronicity, right? And this idea that there's something about this, I'm just talking about this in terms of Neptune and the idea of fantasy and desire, right? That there was, I think a lot of what played out in my own madness, or there's just something about like the social field is invested with fantasy and desire. It's inherent with the social field, right? And, this could be like sexual desires, sexual fantasies. You're out drinking with your friends, and there's some cute girl or something, and you kind of, if you don't get lucky, there's at least this fantasy of like, what if, right? And the problem of that is like, for me, there's some sort of sexual Kundalini thing of being consumed by these kind of fantasies or whatever. But I have to admit, there's this time that led to my psychosis, where I was volunteering at a music festival, and I had lost my bag of weed. I was a weed smoker. I probably did too many drugs at the festival, and there was some girl that I hung out with a little bit at the festival that was kind of cute or something like that. And I had there was some kind of basic desire, or like, I don't know, it's a music festival, what do you expect, right? So there's some basic desire investment in this particular girl that I'd met. And also, I was cleaning up all the recycling in the aftermath of this festival, and most of the people had left, and I had lost my weed, and I just had this craving, like, I don't have any weed, and I could just really like go for like taking a break and having a puff of weed, and then like, at that precise moment when I was thinking that, I turn around and there's the specific girl with a packed pipe and a bowl being like, do you want to smoke some weed with me? And I was like, what the hell? Because I was just thinking like, oh, that girl's kind of cute, and I lost my weed. And it was like and this is sort of like, when I was like, is this like manifesting stuff? Because it was like, I had this kind of desire fantasy, And instead of this desire fantasy being just some sort of thing that, oh, wouldn't it be nice if this happened, it actually just materialized just like an instant like that. It was like the specific person who I sort of liked at the festival, who showed up with a packed bowl specifically at the time when I was thinking about it. Now, there could also be, was this not manifestation, or was I just intuiting that this was happening, but interpreting that intuition as a desire, as a sort of wish fulfillment fantasy? Like, some part of me was registering that person was still there, that person still has some wheat, right? And so I'm like, at some level, I'm intuiting that this is something in an influence, and then I read that as being a manifest, basically because the real situation matches up with what I want to happen, right? Similarly, I had other instances where I manifested things in that, but it wasn't really like, it wasn't like consciously making a vision board, but it was basically just, there's certain things that I had a desire for or an interest in, and it just so happened that the reality of what I got was the thing that I was interested in, right? And those things just happened to coincide, right? When they coincide, you're like, wow, I'm in tune with the universe, right? When they don't coincide, it's like you're like, oh, heaven and earth is infinitely apart, right? Because what my vision or my dream of what I want in life is very much separate from what is actually happening in life, right? But what's interesting is that my psychosis didn't actually have to do with me being, it was by having some synchronicities, I started to be like, figuring that there was going to be some sort of thing manifest that never manifested, and then being kind of teased by like certain things manifest, and then other things I'm just stuck with this dream of things, these desires that I want that I have no way of actualizing, and I just have to suffer with this pain of having my desires not match up with reality, right? But there's something about this which I also have, for the sake that I have my Deleuze and Guattari here, and I'm rereading this again as well, I'm going to jump into Deleuze and Guattari. I guess I could keep it simple, and to hell with being simple. We're going to do it. So with that in mind, this is a Deleuze-Guattarian perspective from the ANTIOEDIPUS. To a certain degree, the traditional logic of desire is all wrong from the very outset. From the very first step that the Platonic logic of desire forces us to take, making us choose between production and acquisition. Is desire making something, or is it taking something, getting something? From the moment that we place desire on the side of acquisition, we make desire in an idealistic, dialectical, nihilistic conception, which causes us to look upon it as primarily as a lack. This is a Lacanian influence. Lack of an object, lack of the real object. It is true that the other side, the production side, has not been entirely ignored. Kant, for instance, must be credited with effecting a critical revolution as regards the theory of desire, by attributing to it the faculty of being through its representations, the cause of the reality of the objects of these representations. But it is not by chance that Kant chooses superstitious beliefs, hallucinations, and fantasies as illustrations of this definition of desire. See how that kind of goes with this, what Gurdjieff is talking about, how Kundalini is primarily a kind of a desire hallucination that people take to be some sort of spiritually lightening thing when it's not. This is the same thing as Kant is talking about. The productive force of desire is creating these kind of phantasmic images of things that you want that are like almost like hallucinations, right? Or fantasies. As Kant would have it, we are well aware that the real object can be produced only by an external causality and an external mechanisms. Nonetheless, this knowledge does not prevent us from believing in the intrinsic power of desire to create its own object, if only in an unreal, hallucinatory, or delirious form, or from representing this causality as stemming from within desire itself. The reality of the object, insofar as it is produced by desire, is thus a psychic reality. Hence, it can be said that Kant's critical revolution changes nothing essential. This way of conceiving of productivity does not question the validity of the classical conception of desire as a lack. Rather, it uses this conception as a support and a buttress, and merely examines its implications more carefully. In point of fact, if desire is the lack of the real object, its very nature as a real entity depends upon an essence of lack that produces the fantasized object. Desire thus conceives of as production through merely the production of fantasies has been explained perfectly by psychoanalysis. On the very lowest level of interpretation, this means that the real object that desire lacks is related to an extrinsic natural or social production, whereas desire intrinsically produces an imaginary object that functions as a double of reality, as though there were a dreamed of object behind every real object, or a mental production behind all real productions. This conception does not necessarily compel psychoanalysis to engage in the study of gadgets and markets in the form of an utterly dreary and dull psychoanalysis of the object, psychoanalytic studies of packages of noodles, cars, or thingamajigs. But even when the fantasy is interpreted in depth, not simply as an object, but as a specific machine that brings desire itself front and center, this machine is merely theatrical, and the complementarity of what it sets apart still remains. It is not now need that is defined in terms of relative lack and determined by its own object, whereas desire is regarded as what produces the fantasy and produces itself by detaching itself from the object, though at the same time it intensifies the lack by making it absolute. An incurable insufficiency of being, an inability to be that is life itself. Hence, the presentation of desire as something supported by needs, while these needs and their relationship to the object as something that is lacking or missing continue to be the basis of productivity of desire, the theory of underlying support. In a word, when the theoretician reduces desiring production to a production of fantasy, he is content to exploit to the fullest the idealist principle that defines desire as a lack rather than a process of production, of industrial production. Clement Rosset puts it very well. Every time the emphasis is put on lack, that desire supposedly suffers from as a way of defining its object, the world acquires as its double some other sort of world. In accordance with the following line of argument, there is an object that desire feels the lack of, hence the world does not contain each and every object that exists. There is at least one object missing, the one that desire feels the lack of, hence there exists some other place that contains the key to desire, the missing, that's missing in this world. If desire produces, its product is real. If desire is productive, it can be productive only in the real world and can produce only reality. Desire is the set of passive synthesis that engineer partial objects, flows, and bodies, and that function as units of production. The real is the end product, the result of the passive synthesis of desire as autoproduction of the unconscious. Desire does not lack anything. It does not lack its object. It is rather the subject that is missing in desire, or the desire lacks a fixed subject. There is no fixed subject unless there is repression. Desire and its object are one and the same thing. The machine as desire, the machine as machine of a machine. Desire is a machine, the object of desire is another machine connected to it. Hence, the product is something removed or deducted from the process of producing. Between the act of producing and the product, something becomes detached, thus giving the vagabond, the nomad subject, a residuum. The objective being of desire is the real in and of itself. There is no particular form of existence that can be labeled psychic reality. As Marx notes, what exists in fact is not lack but passion as a natural and sensuous object. Desire is not bolstered by needs, but rather the contrary, needs are derived from desire. They are counterproducts within the real that desire produces. Lack is a counter effect of desire. It is deposited, distributed, vacuolized within a real that is natural and social. Desire always remains in close touch with the conditions of objective existence. It embraces them and follows them, shifts when they shift, and does not outlive them. For that reason, it so often becomes the desire to die, whereas need is a measure of withdrawal of the subject that has lost its desire at the same time that it loses the passive synthesis of these conditions. This is precisely the significance of a need as a search in a void, hunting about, trying to capture or become a parasite of passive synthesis in whatever vague world they happen to exist in. It is no use saying we are not green plants. We have long since been able to synthesize chlorophyll, so it's necessary to eat. Desire then becomes this abject fear of lacking something. But it should be noted that this is not a phrase uttered by the poor or the dispossessed. On the contrary, such people know that they are close to grass, almost akin to it, and that desire needs very few things. Not those leftovers that chance to come their way, but the very things that are continually taken from them. And that what is missing is not things a subject feels the lack of somewhere deep down inside himself, but rather the objectivity of man, the objective being of man, for whom to desire is to produce, and to produce within the realm of the real. The real is not impossible. On the contrary, within the real, everything is possible. Everything becomes possible. Desire does not express a molar lack within the subject. Rather, the molar organization deprives desire of its own objective being. Revolutionaries, artists, seers are content to be objective, merely objective. They know that desire clasps life in its powerfully productive embrace and reproduces in it in a way that is all the more intense because it has few needs. And never mind those who believe that this is very easy to say, or that this is sort of idea to be found in books. From the little reading I had done, I had observed that the men who were most in life, who were molding life, who were life itself, ate little, slept little, and owned little or nothing. They had no illusions about duty or the perpetuation of their kith and kin, or the preservation of the state. The phantasmal world is the world which has never been fully conquered over. It is the world of the past, never of the future. To move forward, clinging to the past, is like dragging a ball and chain. And this quote is from none other than the man himself, Henry Miller. And, I was thinking about also reading some Nietzsche, but I will spare you the Nietzsche because I felt like I just read a whole bunch. Maybe next time I'll read some Nietzsche. But I think that gives us a lot to talk about. Just to go over what I said before I stop. This is like, if you're paying attention, you can see how what Deleuze and Guattari are saying and what Gurdjieff are saying. You might code one as being a conservative traditionalist, and you could code the other as being these rebellious, Nietzschean Marxists or something. But if you actually listen to what they're saying, it's the same thing, right? That there's we get lost in a phantasm of this thing that creates this idea that we interpret this, or we're given this story from psychology that this is because we are inherently lacking. There's something about the emptiness of the person, right? It could be the Buddhist emptiness. There's no subject here. Because we don't have a fixed subjectivity, a fixed concrete self, that we try to do all our desires are to, we want to fill the void, right? There's some sort of inherent existential vacuum or inherent existential void to fill. Deleuze and Guattari are saying that, honestly, happiness is not complicated. Basically, contentment means that if you have your basic needs met, you've got food, shelter, water, you've got access, or the other needs, maybe access to education. Like, there's also the basic thing about sexual desire or something like that, right? If all you need is to be well fed, to have a roof over your head, And then you've got, let's say you could make it as base or as not base as you want. It could be about gratifying your pleasure drive, or it could be about having meaningful relations, emotional connections with others, right? There's certain things where, like, you don't actually need that much of it to be happy and content. But the thing is, we have an artificially induced sense of lack, saying that you're not enough. You're going to have to go out there, buy a gym membership, put yourself through this whole self-improvement hustle to make yourself into this better person because you're just not good as you are. Or you can buy our products. You can have, you're not going to get the girl unless you have a luxury sports car to impress her with. Nobody's going to want you unless you have our commodities. So instead of like actually just going, if you're like, I'm lonely, I wish I had some people in my life as friends. No, it's not good enough just to have friends around to talk to. You need to make yourself a productive, good person in society and do all these things, and then using this thing about your basic human needs as a carrot on the stick to keep you constantly, being chased around, that you have to be like, I have to do X, Y, and Z in order to be happy, and you spend your whole life being miserable because you buy the story that you are essentially not good as you are, and you have to do all these things, buy them. Here, everybody, sign up to my self-improvement class. Sign up, I'll be your life coach. I'll tell you how to fix your life so you don't, but the thing is, it's funny because there's these moments where what you desire and what the world is like actually coincide, and you're like, it's a manifestation. I'm in alignment. I'm just in the flow of creation. I'm in the flow of life because what I want to create is what's creating, and I'm involved actively in doing that. But then what actually you want could be very simple, but that is intentionally made more difficult because we need to create a fucking capitalist surplus, right? We need to get you to produce all this shit that you don't need to produce for somebody else to extract value from you. And then if you, maybe if you do that in a good way, we'll reward you by making you feel like you deserve all the things that to make you happy in life, which could be very simple. It could not be, but we have this artificially created world where, that we intentionally have to live in a world where everybody's frustrated, everybody's depressed, everybody's angry. Then the funny thing too is that if you actually are in an affluent society, if you're privileged, instead of being like, you spend your time collecting a whole bunch of bullshit that you don't need, and then meanwhile living in a state of hyper-vigilant insecurity that, oh my God, I hope nobody breaks into my house and steals all my belongings when I'm gone, I hope that I don't get mugged, and we need to get police to we need law and order because, oh my God, the problem isn't that we lack, it's because we have too much stuff and we're hoarding it like fucking the smog dragon sitting on a pile of gold, and we basically are these reptile people we can't share our wealth and resources. We have to act like these greedy pigs who are hyper vigilant that somebody's going to come away and take all our precious things from us. And then from that we have to be like, oh, but no, like that's not the reason why I'm upset. It's not because I'm fearful and greedy and I hoard all this stuff to myself. It's because I'm not good. I have to go and work out. I have to become a strong, tough man. I have to get my gun license so I can sit up hyper vigilantly, paranoid for all these fuckers are going to take my shit away. And meanwhile, so, and we've got a government where we've got the most wealthy, affluent country in the world, and everybody feels like they have to rather than creating a system where you have, I don't know, your basic needs are easier met, people feel like they have to make themselves more miserable for the sake of because that's the world they believe in, right? So there's a bit of a rant, but hopefully you guys get something out of this. If you're interested in any of this stuff, send me a message, let me know, and I'll, let you. Oh, if you want to get involved in a Gurdjieff group with somebody who likes Deleuze and Guattari, now's your opportunity, right? Otherwise, long live the new flesh.